Hello and welcome to the last of 6 presentations in the Nuancing National Security Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live this evening or reviewing the recording later, we do invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. A central mandate of any national government is national security, but the responsibility involves much more than traditional military defense capabilities. Today, while balancing military and diplomacy priorities, national governments assess and combat threats in cyberspace and outer space, water supplies and power grids, food production, and energy chains. In this 6-part virtual series, the IRC is taking a deep dive into the national security arena, offering historical context and global perspective for core dimensions of national security, and exploring the risks, priorities, and tactics on the radar of U.S. security policy. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore energy security. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Nuancing National Security Series possible. In particular, thanks to supporting series sponsors Buttonwood Financial Group, Garmin, Nicole Gresham-Perry, and Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Kirk Doan is a dedicated IRC member, past board member, and current advisory board member. Kirk is a partner at IRC organizational member Stinson, where he assists clients in matters related to health law, real estate, and business law. Kirk is a longtime convener of one of Kansas City's Great Decisions discussion groups at Stinson's downtown office, which brings together individuals with different points of view for deep dive conversations on some of today's most pressing global issues and topics. An avid traveler, Kirk is also a storied philatelist who shares stamps from around the world with attendees at IRC in-person programs. May those times return very soon. Kirk, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Robert F. Cekuta. Ambassador Cekuta has spent over 40 years with appointments with the U.S. State Department, focusing on economics, business, and trade. Particular topics of interest include food security, energy, and technology. He is also an expert on sanctions and conflicts goods, such as conflict diamonds. He has had postings in Vienna, Austria, Kabul, Afghanistan, Baghdad, Iraq, Johannesburg, South Africa, Berlin, Germany, Sana'a, Yemen, Tokyo, Japan, Tirana, Albania, and Kosovo. In July of 2014, he was appointed as ambassador to Azerbaijan and served from February of 2015 until March of 2018. When Ambassador Cekuta and his wife Anne returned from their foreign postings with their 3 children, he was relating to me that he realized that his kids had spent most of their childhood growing up in foreign countries and must have believed that the United States was a foreign country when they came to the US. Ambassador Cekuta speaks English, German, Arabic, and Albanian, and he received his formal education from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he got his Bachelor's of Science and he received master's degrees from the Thunderbird School of Global Management and from the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., also known as the War College. I would now like to turn the program over to Ambassador Cekuta, who will give opening remarks for about 20 to 25 minutes. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A, and we will take them up with the ambassador at that time. So I would like to now turn the program over to Ambassador Cekuta. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be able to join you tonight and to talk a bit about energy and how it fits in the international relations picture and how it affects, particularly affects U.S. foreign policy and the lives of Americans. I think it's fair to say that energy security is back on Americans' radar. It's key to our everyday lives as well as to our economy. We have not really updated our ways of thinking about energy security. Especially in foreign policy, though. And I would argue that an update is called for. Given current and evolving realities, both here in the United States as well as globally. Having worked for decades in the State Department, I can tell you that energy security has been an ongoing concern in our foreign policy. Energy security is regarded as one of the key components in our overall national security picture. It's also an important element in other governments' foreign policy calculations. That said, though, the way the United States thinks about and defines energy security and the way it plays in our overall foreign policy has changed only slightly over the years. And I think we should be thinking now about a significant reevaluation. This need for reevaluating how we think about energy security in our foreign policy and how we modify our diplomacy as a result isn't just because of the critical role that energy plays in thinking about combating or dealing with climate change, or the new ways other governments have sought to weaponize energy, weaponize the delivery and the supply of energy. It's also due to the changing technologies and the changing consumer demands around the world. New thinking about energy security is needed as well because of the changing international landscape, the growing demand for energy in emerging markets and developing countries, and the impacts each of these developments have on the lives and the well-being of Americans. And so what I'd like to do is sketch out some ideas on the role our need for energy plays in U.S. foreign policy, and hopefully sort of provoke a conversation tonight on why we need to be thinking differently about energy security. Let me start, though, by looking at how we have tended to think about energy security and give a definition. And I would define energy security as the assured supply of adequate energy at an affordable price. So assured supply, adequate amount, affordable price. By and large, Americans have thought of energy security in terms of access to gasoline and oil. This was a function of what happened back in the 70s with the Yom Kippur War, the overthrow of the Shah, the gasoline lines, the shortages that we experienced at that time. In recent years, with the tremendous growth of US oil and natural gas production, Americans have rightly tended to feel more secure. There's even talk about energy dominance, of being the United States being dominant in the energy world. This was because our domestic oil and natural gas production grew to a point that we not only essentially met domestic demand, but were able to export for the first time in decades. These increased domestic supplies also contributed to lower prices at the gas pump, although I would argue that Saudi and Russian dynamics played an important role in lowering those prices until recently as well. Yet, despite the increases in American oil and gas production, our energy security is not a given. Today's realities are that energy security relies more than just getting enough hydrocarbons out of the ground. Moreover, like other aspects of our national security, our energy security is affected by developments abroad, no matter how much oil and gas we have here at home. For us to be truly secure, we need to help see the energy security of our allies, our friends, our partners is not threatened either. If one of our partners, one of our allies, another country is insecure, so are we. So what are these other factors that affect Americans' energy security? And how should they be considered part of our national security picture in our foreign policy thinking? Especially as we grapple with the question of climate change and decreasing carbon footprints, something that's really going to be in the headlines in the coming weeks as the world meets in Glasgow, November 1st to 12th. A primary factor is changing and rising global demand. Back in the 70s, the United States and other developed industrial countries consumed the bulk of the world's energy and called the shots on the demand side. The rise of China, India, and other large emerging economies has changed that situation. And in this century, their demand for energy is a crucial factor in energy markets and hence in international energy security. China and other emerging markets are driving energy demand today above 2019 levels, which had been the peak. Now I'm going to kind of go a little wonky here with statistics, but please bear with me. Global energy demand this year will rise 4.6%, more than offsetting the 4% decrease we saw last year, and pushing demand 5% above, 0.5% rather, above 2019 levels. 2019 basically had been the peak here. Almost 70% of the projected increase in global energy demand is in emerging markets and in developing countries. Demand in those countries is expected to rise 3.4% above 2019 levels. Energy demand in the developed economies, on the other hand, in the United States and the other developing countries, is expected to be 3% below pre-COVID levels. And demand for energy in developing countries and in emerging market economies will continue to grow. There are over 2.6 billion people, over 2.6 billion people in the world today who do not have a safe way to cook their food. They rely on wood, charcoal, dung, or some other means, all of which harm their health and the health of women who are cooking the food and those who are living with these harmful fumes. Moreover, there are about 840 million people in the world today without electricity. Now that number is down from the 1.2 billion people back in 2010 and shows that progress has been made in electrification. But there are hundreds of millions of people out there who lack even basic electricity. And there are probably many millions more whose current supply of electricity is inadequate, who would use more electricity if they could. On top of this, the number of people in this world is expected to continue to grow. Expectations are another 1.8 billion people will come into the world by 2045. 80% of whom will be living in the developing world. These numbers all mean that there's going to be a growing need for energy around the world, not necessarily so much in developing countries like the United States, but in the rest of the world. And the key question will be how to provide it. Another critical factor connected to energy supplies and thus energy security is infrastructure. We've long thought about the physical plant for oil and gas production, processing, storage, and distribution. We've worked out systems to get our fuel to our military, get the fuel our military needs to conduct its operation. Fuels that are so large that the US military is often the world's largest single energy consumer. We've worried about choke points, such as the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Oman, the Suez Canal of Bab el-Mandeb on either end of the Red Sea, the Straits of Malacca in Southeast Asia. We've looked at the diversification of oil suppliers, at the creation of strategic petroleum reserves, at the establishment of refineries that could take oil from sources other than the Middle East. We established an International Energy Agency and other mechanisms to work with allies and coordinate our energy security policies. However, decisions made decades ago may no longer stand us in good stead. For example, for years we looked to import more oil from Venezuela, and we developed our refineries to work best with that heavy crude. Two problems resulted. One, Venezuela went down the road to misrule and made a much less secure supplier. a country that frankly we don't want to be buying oil from. Another is that the crude oil the US recovered, we figured out how to tap our tremendous tight oil supplies, is lighter and doesn't work as well in these refineries that we have built. Moreover, and this is a key point as well, infrastructure ages and needs to be replaced. Also, when a major facility is built, there's a little stomach for tearing it down and replacing it before it's necessary to do so. The economics of the infrastructure is really key here. But let's get away from oil and gas. Here in the United States, over the past year, we have seen the vulnerability of our electrical grids. We are not alone in facing the problems of aging electrical infrastructure or its ability to stand up to a severe winter or summer storm. And in getting away from oil and natural gas, let's look at the tremendous growth in solar and wind as means to generate needed electricity. This development, however, also has an interesting national security angle. Clean energy technologies, along with a number of other high-tech items and systems, rely on rare earths and other minerals. Copper, for example, which is something that's become extremely expensive this past year with constrained supplies. Many of these minerals and materials come from China. China, however, has used the access to rare earths as a means to try and coerce a neighbor. For example, in its dispute with Japan over the islands of Cekuta, islands in the East China Sea. The supply chain disruptions over this past year resulted from the economic dislocations accompanying COVID-19 pandemic further reinforce the reality that the materials other than hydrocarbons can be important to energy security, and that our energy security can be disrupted when these materials supplies, the flow of these material supplies are disrupted. There's a human element in all this here as well. The solar panel manufacturing sector depends on a supply of cheap components made in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China. China has come to dominate the global solar panel market for global the production of global solar panels. At the same time, there is a strong desire to avoid buying products made with forced weaker labor. Yet most photovoltaic cells are made with the polysilicon components that are produced through an industrial process that requires extremely high temperatures. Xinjiang has some of the cheapest power in China because of the large coal deposits. As a result, Xinjiang is home to 4 of the 5 largest polysilicon factories in the world. In other words, the material we need for producing the solar power is coming from a part of China, which is increasingly becoming known as a base for repressive human rights activities for forced labor. China today produces 82% of the world's polysilicon, up from 26% in 2010. In the period 2010 to 2020, the share of polysilicon produced in the United States dropped 35%, dropped from 35% in 2010 to 5% in 2020. As the New York Times reported in January, a report by Horizon Advisory found that, quote, Xinjiang's rising solar energy technology sector is connected to a broad program of assigned labor in China, including methods that fit well-documented patterns of forced labor, unquote. This brings me to another factor we need to think about when we need to be thinking about when we talk about energy security. The question of where a power generating facility or refinery or a pipeline or power lines are located. There are discussions of social justice, as well as debates over whether and where to build natural gas or crude oil pipelines. We've seen this in the United States over Keystone. Internationally, governments in other parts of the world face these same problems. Over this summer, I was working on a paper that looked at public opposition to the construction of large-scale hydroelectric facilities in Georgia. And we're looking at what happened there with an eye to helping other governments figure out how to better handle those kind of situations. Another frequent problem overseas has been the natural resource curse, where countries earn great returns from producing and exporting oil or some other natural resource, and they fall prey to high levels of corruption. One thing we did during my time in the State Department's Energy Resources Bureau was to work ways to boost transparency. So the information on what energy companies paid governments, what governments said they earned, and where that money was being spent. That was all that information was available to citizens as a way to fight corruption and reinforce good governance. We also offered to help countries new to the energy patch with developing strong legal frameworks. Doing so could avoid problems that doing so was a way to help avoid problems others had had. And in the payoff in doing so was in the form of more prosperous, more stable countries. Energy security also increasingly entails the integrity of IT and cyber systems. In fact, here's where we really see the point that American and global energy security is no longer just a geostrategic matter, but something determined by technology as well. In talking about these particular threats to our national security, the integrity of our energy infrastructure, our dependency on rare earths and other critical materials from abroad, the growing connection between AT, AI, and other in our energy systems. There is another underlying reality which I hope is becoming apparent. That reality is even as we produce more of our energy needs at home, even as we export energy to other countries, we remain part of the global energy system, part of the global economy. Our energy security is linked to the energy security of other countries. Even if we produce here in the United States all the oil and natural gas we can consume, oil and gas prices are determined by global market forces. A market disruption elsewhere can, and usually does, drive up prices here for consumers, whether those consumers are private individuals or manufacturers or other business enterprises. I want to get into the discussion questions, and so I will close out my prepared remarks by quickly flagging other realities that affect energy security and thus factor into American foreign policy. One is that energy security is not just a defensive game. There are governments today which see energy supplies as a tool for advancing their own interests and even to use as a weapon for coercion. Key examples here are with Russia and Ukraine. In 2006, Russia cut off supplies of gas to Ukraine. Russia cut off gas to Ukraine again in 2014. Russia tampered with the Ukrainian electrical grid. Gazprom raised prices. Gazprom's prices are not set by the market. They're set by how good your relations are or how close your relations are with Russia. And again, I want to come back to this point that energy supplies remain very much part of the global picture. And so when it comes to energy security, countries and societies, a key point to think about as we move into the discussion here, and also as we talk about the upcoming meetings in Glasgow, we can be talking about reducing our carbon footprint, reducing our energy usage. But when it comes to energy security, countries and societies are all coming from different starting points. When we talk about changes needed to arrest climate change, we need to realize there are literally hundreds of millions of people out there now finally able to get electric lights, refrigerators, cars, air conditioners, or heaters. Moreover, there are hundreds of millions of others who are looking to reach that point, to get to their standard of living up to the point where they too can start to have such a lifestyle. And again, there are billions of people who don't have, whose lives are threatened every day by the way they cook their food. These are the reality that countries need to address. And they come back again, the talks are coming up, they're going to affect how the governments approach those talks. And there's something that really does fit into the foreign policy of the United States and the foreign policy of other governments. So with that, I hope I've sketched out the basis for some questions and further discussion. And I look forward to your comments and observations and to have a good conversation right now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Start my video. Okay. Evan, I think I have my video on. Can you bring me up?
You're on.
You're good to go, Kirk. We've got you.
Okay. All right. Ambassador, the United States has justified much of its overseas military and policing actions over the last several decades with the rationale of assuring energy security to the United States and its allies. Recently, there have been efforts to try to get those allies to pick up more of the burden of that activity. Do you see that continuing, and where do you think that will be going?
Well, I think it is going to continue, and I think it's also something that is, we have worked with allies not just sort of on the military front, to improve energy security, but on other fronts as well. For example, through the International Energy Agency, we set up a system whereby back in the 70s, each of the developed countries created strategic petroleum reserves. So the idea was if there was a supply disruption, that oil could be released and could be used to address the disruption. So we wouldn't have the kind of situations we had in the 70s. And that's worked. We've used that. Actually, I was involved once back in 2011 when we did a withdrawal. We pulled out oil from our strategic petroleum reserves. Australia and others did as well, to increase supplies in the aftermath of the disruptions that came from the civil war in Libya. And that basically one of the things that really did was help get oil out and help decrease the break the rise in prices that was going on at the time. And again, improve Americans' security and other countries' security. So we can also work through the IEA and other things in terms of seeing where problems are coming and start addressing it through policies that can head off the problems with those that are coming. One of the things which we did in the International Energy Agency when I was on the board of governors there was it was set up back in the 70s. It was set up, you had to be an OECD member, one of the rich industrialized countries. Well, as I was saying, something that's happened is that China, India, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, these are countries that are now really important consumers. And so what we did, the rules were such you needed to be a member of the OECD. We figured out a way around that so that these countries could also participate in the work of the IEA. They could understand what we were doing. We could understand what they were doing. And through those sort of, the communication, discussion, coordination of policies, avoid disruptions and have saner policies that could lead to improved energy securities. Now, I'm going back to one point, of course, in your question, our naval forces that are needed to protect the traffic through the Bab el-Mandab, the Straits of Hormuz, or Malacca. Now, there are other countries besides the United States that participate in this. Of course, in the last couple of weeks, famously, we've just talked a lot about Australia. Other countries are working in the off the Horn of Africa, which is where the pirates had been a big problem. It's not just the United States. Now, one of the countries, of course, which has been involved in fighting those pirates, and a country that is very interested in the smooth flow of energy through the Straits of Malacca is China. So it can become a little more complicated, of who all is in there trying to move things. One of the reasons that may be behind may be behind the Silk Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative that China's putting forward, is a desire to get oil from the Middle East in ways that don't have to go through the Straits of Malacca. And that was one reason. There was an oil pipeline that was being built to Burma, for example, to China. There was a way of sort of drawing that through. So yes, other countries are working with us to improve energy security. We have good discussions. The key thing that my successors are continuing to do in Washington. But of course, there's also the problem that sometimes other countries are doing things as well that may parallel, but not necessarily be entirely in line with what it is we're trying to do. Is that too diplomatic?
Well, we have a question that came in from the Q&A line regarding technology security. The question pointed out that Tesla is now manufacturing its own computer chips for its automobiles. And I had an experience this weekend. My family is in the snowmobile business and they bring them in from the Bombardier company in Canada. We got 75 snowmobiles and we could not take them out of the boxes because they did not have chips. And that way they do not bill you for the snowmobiles until the chips are sent to you. Kind of a floor planning deal. And they said it might be 2 or 3 months before the chips might arise for those snowmobiles. So the question also points out the Department of Defense Trusted Foundry Program. Are there government programs or ways that we can address some of the technology security with that these two examples bring to light?
Well, the chip issue is one that there's a lot of discussion on in Washington right now. And I mean, it's such, I don't think I can really comment very wisely on it, except to say, yes, it's a mess. It's a mess in everything from availability of electronics to automobiles. We have a farm up in Maine, and the prices of used cars actually skyrocketed, basically because of the demand. You can't get a new car. Trucks and so forth are also unavailable because of this. That's a definite problem. One of the things which we've often looked at in the government has been the idea of, does it make sense to try to establish stockpiles of critical minerals, critical materials, like we did with oil. We actually talked about at one point in the International Energy Agency, should we be thinking about trying to do something like that with gas? Because with the Russians and what they were done with Ukraine, and of course there were follow-on effects. If you stop the flow of gas into Ukraine, then how does it get to Poland or Germany? This was something which we looked at. Part of it, of course, is what you can. There are ways you can do that. Problem we found too, even just with strategic petroleum reserves, is great. You've got crude oil. What does crude oil do for you in your car? You've got to have it refined. And so we really, this hit us back with some of the hurricanes, where actually we looked at releases from the SPR, and it was great, except for the fact that what everybody was looking for was gasoline or fuel or jet fuel. So that was one factor. But we did look at this idea of critical materials. You have a couple things that came into that discussion. One is, are you buying the right stuff? Second thing is, how much of it do you buy? And do you end up buying a lot of something that you then may never actually need, use, or want? And so that was a factor. Another factor which we looked at is, despite the name rare earths, for example, aren't rare. We have them in a number of countries. There was a lot of discussion recently in Afghanistan, but Central Asia, here in the United States. The problem is, to get the rare earths, you have to do a lot of processing. And so there are environmental and other impacts that come from the processing. It's not a very clean effort. And this has been one factor in this. The Chinese are willing to do this. Others are not. And so we looked, actually, there were a couple of mines in the United States that had actually closed, and trying to look at those and reopening those years ago. I know some of that's still been under discussion. Then, of course, as far as you get the chips, that's an actual manufacturing process as well. So I think we've all gotten to learn that just-in-time delivery is great when everything is working fine. And in the past, I've lost track now, we're kind of over a year and a half. We've learned a lot of things don't necessarily always work fine. And so these questions of manufacturing, of where you manufacture, how much, how you move stuff, how often you move stuff, what is the figures of even like moving an iPhone and making a thing, how many times it goes back and forth across the Pacific. These are things that people are now starting to look at more carefully. Here in the United States, also in Europe. And there are a number of countries, I know that this is actually something that some in Central Asia and other places, like India, doesn't make sense to try to put a number of different facilities out there, duplicate, and to diversify, like you would your portfolio, diversify your production points, diversify your sources, so that we're not all dependent on one place. I'm sorry that got to be a rather long answer, but hopefully kind of got at it.
But we have another question from Jim Borthwick, who is a frequent Great Decisions group member in our IRC discussions. And he raises the issue of pipeline politics. And what is the U.S. strategy with regards to the Russia to Germany pipeline and the Keystone pipeline? And is there a consistency to it?
I would say, I'm going to separate those because there really are separate issues. With Keystone, the State Department, when I was there, was responsible for licensing pipelines across the border. And that's how we got involved in this. The trouble then was you had to look at the whole of the pipeline process. And here we have this question, whether you want to call it social justice or not in my backyard. How do people feel about having pipelines, other infrastructure? In Maine, there's been a big fight about putting a big power transmission line that will bring hydropower in from Canada. So again, even though people are wanting to reduce the carbon footprint, and here's hydropower, they're fighting. Well, we don't want the wires, but you need to. You've got to move the electricity somehow, and you're going to move by wire. That was, I think, a factor in something like Keystone. Key thing with Keystone was it was oil coming from a very reliable, good, long-standing friend. Now, when we go to Nord Stream, what is the purpose that the Russians, who are basically paying for this, are building this pipeline? Right now, there's already more than adequate supplies of pipelines to move natural gas into Europe. What this pipeline essentially is doing is circumventing the pipelines that go through Ukraine. And so a way for Russia to put pressure on Ukraine to shut off the flow of gas through Ukraine and shut off the transit fees, which Ukraine earns from the pipeline. So it's part of the hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting against Ukraine. Russia has also said, just briefly, has engaged in cyber activities to disrupt the Ukrainian grid, things like that. So the construction of Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that basically will bring Russian gas into Germany, circumventing Ukraine, undercutting Ukraine's position in Europe and its independence and its stability, its prosperity, directly to German markets. Germany has had a strong role in terms of supporting Ukraine independence and so forth, but it's taken on this pipeline. And it's a pipeline which is very much contested within Europe, within members of the EU. Poland does not like it at all. Denmark was opposed to it for a long time. The Netherlands does. And so the question became, okay, European energy security requires diversification. We should not just be getting energy from Russia. You're looking at buying increased energy from Russia through Nord Stream 2. What's going on here? And there's pipelines which we built, which EU worked with through the Caucasus, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, that bring energy out of Central Asia, diversifying things, bring gas to Italy and to Turkey, to the Caucasus. Nord Stream, the Germans have insisted that this project can go forward, that it is not going to hurt other countries. So actually, an old friend of mine has now been appointed by President Biden to manage this issue and to push back on it. I'm not sure how this is going to play out. The German elections have a factor in this because the Greens didn't like the pipeline for environmental reasons. Merkel did. And so it's an ongoing question. One thing I would note is that there have been changes in the European regulations that have to do with natural gas. They're called the Third Energy Package. And they're designed to increase competition. And so one of the things I think will be important is, what does the EU do? Does it live up to its commitments to increase competition, to make Gazprom act like a company? That'll be an important thing. But the pipeline itself, it's unfortunate that it's been built. It is pretty much complete. Whether it will be left unused is still a very difficult diplomatic matter.
Okay, I have another question. This is from Michael Vanderpool, and it's specific to Azerbaijan. And he said that some of the regional standing of Azerbaijan is based upon its energy projection, and this might be extrapolated to other countries that are energy exporters. What happens when the energy runs out, and how do they compete with regional players such as Iran and Russia?
This is actually, there's a whole group of people who are actually sort of looking at those questions. How do you adapt to a changing demand for oil? Now, I mean, the figures which actually, there was a program today. The head of OPEC was talking. They will be releasing their energy outlook tomorrow, and they are really bullish on the outlook for oil, seeing the demand is remaining high through 2045, basically because of the growing demand in the developing world. Others are not so sure, and part of this, of course, is going to be a function of policy decisions. I can tell you, as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, they are looking at producing. They're actually exploring new fields. They're trying to bring some new ones online. They have been a very good partner in terms of developing pipelines, first for oil and now for natural gas, to diversify. Azerbaijan is key, I think, supplies Israel with about 40% of its oil. But they're looking down the pike as well. The famous line from Sheikh Hamani, who was the oil minister for Saudi Arabia for many years back, actually during the time in the 70s, the early 80s, his line was, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of rocks. And there's something to that, and that's the question of the technologies that are evolving, how it's going to be used. There's a lot of a number of analysts I've been hearing recently are talking about energy refining, for example, maybe less for gasoline for automobiles, but still fuel for trucks and for jets. And also a lot of energy, a lot of oil being used, natural gas being used for petrochemicals. And the point that they keep making is how many things are actually oil-based. Probably the plastics in our glasses are oil-based. The point people made, even just there's been a tremendous rise in the need for some of these compounds over the past year because of the protective materials needed to deal with COVID. The glycol that's used in the vaccines. So there is this sort of, I think there's going to have to be some shifts. And I know that governments are looking at how to shift. Some companies are certainly looking at that. Some companies are taking different stances, different policies. Some are sort of saying, I'm an oil company and I'm going to keep producing oil and natural gas. Even some oil companies that used to look down their nose at natural gas are now producing more natural gas than producing oil. Others are looking, okay, what are the markets going to be like? Some, we're seeing this particularly as a result of pressure on the boards of international oil companies, are looking at ways that they can decrease their carbon footprint even as they continue to produce oil and natural gas. So there's a number of different sort of strategies out there, I guess, in terms of answering the question. There are a number of different strategies out there. Some are looking to get away and move into different things entirely. Some people, for example, even I've heard this, using the gas pipelines would be later used for hydrogen if we move to a hydrogen-based economy. These different ideas are all in play. It's a kind of watch this space, because I think anybody who tells you right now, this is what's going to happen, is probably, I'll be polite, overly optimistic, that there's going to be a lot of different things that are going to be kind of working through. And again, there are a lot of cars out there. There's a lot of infrastructure that's built based on using hydrocarbons. How much of that is going to be replaced and at what speed? So these are all, sorry I gave you an economist answer, which required probably about 15 different hands, but I hope that helped a bit.
Okay. We have a question from Shahid Quadri, and he's observed that the United States has allowed countries such as China and Russia and Germany and Japan and Korea to take a bigger role in energy security in the developing world. And he asks, should the United States take a greater role in energy security in the developing world, and how can we do that?
Well, I think, we do play a role in the energy security and developing world. One thing that we've done, as I sort of mentioned briefly in the remarks, certainly one way, of course, is through our private sector. And those are, US-based multinationals who go out, explore, drill, produce oil and natural gas. Something that doesn't always get the attention, that doesn't make as good a movie, maybe, are the what we call backroom companies. The companies that do the seismic work, that do the computer modeling, that produce the equipment. The United States is a huge producer of oil field equipment, and it's highly technical, highly specialized, very expensive. And it's actually it's really impressive to sort of see this stuff, but we never quite talk about that. So there's the private sector piece is key. And many countries out there want to see US companies in because they know what they're doing. They're good, they've got experience, and they're top notch in terms of technology. As far as the government is concerned, a couple different things. One is advocacy for our companies, that we will be involved in helping companies make deals in countries. We will help companies who are getting a lousy deal from a foreign government, because you're a lawyer, you know that stuff happens, to be polite, that commercial disputes arise, and sometimes they're based on fact and sometimes they're not. So the US will help companies in that situation. The other thing is, and this is why we started to talk about in my remarks for a bit, is that the US has engaged to help countries, particularly countries that are new to the energy patch, get their institutional systems right. We have provided information on geology through cooperation through USGS. We have worked with them to sort of examine their laws. There's a great program that the Commerce Department has, a commercial law development program, which sits down with a country and will help them look at their laws to make sure that they're really kind of compatible with the international system. This is important because if you think of like, with the traffic law or anything else, you want your country's law to mesh with somebody else's. If it mesh, then you're going to have a better business relationship. The other thing is by making these laws fairer and clearer, more transparent, you're avoiding legal problems later on. You're avoiding US companies being disadvantaged later on. And finally, I would say that we've also worked, and this is the work I've mentioned on transparency, with governments to help find ways to understand what's coming in, understand the contracts, to see what's coming in, and for their publics to see the amount of money that's coming into the country, what the government says it has and what the government says it's spending. Because very often this is resource curse. A huge amount of money can come flowing into a country that's not particularly well, its institutions are not particularly well established or well grounded, there can be history of corruption. And this can just be, a massive, something that just does a massive sort of push to exacerbate the corruption levels. If you can get the transparency that the people in the country know, okay, I'll make these numbers up. $50 billion came in. The government said there's only 35 billion. Where did the $5 billion go? So it's a chance to kind of go back. Okay, did you not pay? Did this get stuck in the company? Did it get stuck in a middleman? Did it get stuck in somebody's bank account? Where? And so that transparency is a good way to sort of fight corruption, to build a stronger system of justice, rule of law in a country. So these different ways, helping our companies, helping get the legal situation right in a foreign country, helping establish systems for enforcement. These are ways that the US government can actually help and does help in developing countries.
I have a question regarding the nuclear industry. Countries like Germany have tremendously scaled back on their nuclear energy programs. Does nuclear power have a place in the future?
There are a lot of people who says it does, and a lot of other people who wish it doesn't, sort of put it that way. One of the important things about nuclear is that it doesn't produce any carbon. But there's at the same time, there is a tremendous nervousness in many places in the world about nuclear. Now, that being said, there's also, our nuclear fleet here is old. Probably, one of the questions has been, does it need to be replaced? How does it get replaced? One of the things about the nuclear is there are new technologies that are being developed that are smaller and maybe alternatives to the sort of the big nuclear plants we've sort of had in the past, but can provide significant power to places. There is obviously the questions, of security, of the proliferation that need to be addressed. And these are things that the US government has been looking at. And there's a couple of different things which seem to be moving along pretty quickly. So the first question is there a particular political movement against nuclear, political dislike of nuclear? But if there isn't, then it can be very useful. Japan has a very large nuclear fleet, but they've kind of closed it down and sort of protecting and looking at things again after what happened to Fukushima. Other countries are looking to build up nuclear power plants, and there is potential here for companies. But it's it's one of those things, you want the best technology. This is not technology. You don't want to cut corners with any technology, but I would argue particularly with this. So the Russians are active in advocating construction of power plants, nuclear power plants, so are the Chinese. We work a lot with the Japanese on this front. And I think, again, in terms of fighting climate change, is something that we really do need to be looking at and addressing. One thing, if I can just walk out on you for 1 second, there was a statistic I think we talk about this because a lot of people will say, can't you just do this all with renewables? And this is the thing that last year, the demand for renewables grew 3% globally, and it's set to keep on increasing. But the amount of increased demand, increased production from coal, increased production of electricity from coal dwarfs it. And so when we're talking about the climate change piece, and we think, okay, renewables is growing, but it's not enough. It's not growing. It's growing really fast from a very low base. But we're still dealing with this problem of coal, and we're still dealing with the problem, that comes with the emissions. Now, maybe there's technologies that can help clean that. That's one of the things to be looking at as well. But again, I would come back that nuclear probably has a place here.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ambassador. We've run out of time for additional questions. I'd like to turn the program back to Matthew Hughes, our Executive Director of the International Relations Council of Kansas City.
Thanks. Thank you, and Ambassador, thank you so much for your insightful comments tonight and your world perspective on what's going on with energy security. This is a topic that we could really spend a lot longer looking into because as you're very well aware, Ambassador, this impacts so many aspects of our daily lives all over the world. So thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It was really great to be here.
With that, we bring the Nuancing National Security series to a close, everybody. We hope that you've been able to join us over these last 6 conversations for really a detailed look at what it means to be a nation that's secure, what goes into national security policy from all sorts of perspectives. We have a variety of other programs coming up at the IRC that we hope that you'll join us for as well. Check us out online at irckc.org. And until we see you again, please stay well. Take care.